Wait, did we need a countdown?
No, you don't have to. There's no rules.
We don't have to count down.
We don't have to
go.
count
Hey,
down.
guys.
5, 4, 3,
2, 1. There we go.
What's up, everybody?
Yeah.
How you doing?
Doing well. How you doing?
Really good.
Good. It's been
Really
a good day.
It's been a really good day.
Yeah, I am. It's the end of the week, and I'm
So tired.
so tired.
Yeah.
What song is that? I'm so tired. Oh, that's an old. What was that name of that band that played in Nampa? Man, I forget it. They were an old Christian.
F4X.
It was F4X. It was
Yeah.
F4X.
Shout out to
the-
F4X.
Shout out to F4X, who I haven't heard.
And what did F4X stand for?
Fools for Christ. They were an old
Fools
Christian.
for Christ.
They were an old Christian punk rock band.
Yeah.
They had some pretty hard songs
They
too.
were really good,
Yeah.
too. They were really, really
I
good.
really like those guys.
They were good.
Yeah, they were awesome.
Yeah. I wonder if they're still around.
I'm sure they're.
We should do a whole podcast about a Christian music, kind of history of Christian music, punk rock.
History of the Christian punk scene in the
then we
Treasure
can-
Valley.
And then we can have the wrestler Chad on.
Oh yes,
The masked man.
we could have the masked man wrestler Chad. He could
Yeah.
come up and he could talk about. It would be awesome because we have a lot of ins to the Christian punk rock scene from the '90s in Boise.
Yeah. They
Right.
really do.
Yeah, I was a roadie for Looking Johnny.
Looking Johnny. Shout out to Jeremy Graves.
You were in Looking Johnny, sort of, although they changed their name by then.
Yeah.
What were they when you were there?
Skinny like Riley.
Skinny Like Riley. That's
Yeah.
right. We got some stories on that.
Shout out.
Shout out to Skinny Like Riley.
Shout out to the Supertones.
Yep.
Shout out to MXPX.
Yep.
And
Did you
shout
play
out
with
to
them?
your current favorite Christian band, which is?
My current favorite Christian band?
Yeah, you're a Christian, right?
Yeah, but I don't know if I have a current favorite Christian band. I always say Supertones and 5 Iron Frenzy, which
Or your
aren't.
favorite?
Yeah, which I don't know if they're still. I mean, they're not. I mean, they're kind of like semi-retired. Every now and again, a new album will drop. I go, oh, those guys.
This is the point where sometimes you speak to audiences and it's like, we could definitely speak to an older crowd in the
Yeah,
podcast.
we're talking to
And then
Gen X.
sometimes
Gen
you-
X Christians.
Sometimes
right
you speak to a younger crowd.
Yes.
And the older crowd is like, oh, that's a younger crowd thing.
Yes.
And then sometimes you speak to such a tiny little. We're talking about one person right now.
I
That
know.
cares.
I know. Because we're not only talking.
We're
we're not only talking about the Christian punk / ska
Which is
scene
already
in
tiny.
the '90s, which is already pretty small.
And
We're
saying,
talking about the Boise crowd,
Yep.
just the Boise.
and then we're
scene.
doing shout outs. Like
And then
anyone,
shouts out.
comment
Anybody
below.
heard of FRX?
Comment below.
If you have heard of FRX or Looking Johnny.
or even the Supertones at this point.
Yeah, because if now Supertones and 5 Iron Frenzy, you're expanding well beyond Boise because those guys were, for what they were national
Yeah.
bands. They had a following.
Matt, have you heard of the Supertones?
You're going the wrong direction there, brother.
Matt's on my side.
Is
today.
he on your
Matt,
side? I
have you
think
heard of the
those are my side.
Supertones?
Yeah, Matt, have you heard of Supertones?
Yeah.
Yeah, Matt has heard of it.
Okay.
I just won, dude.
Okay.
He clearly was coming
Okay.
from my side.
Matt has heard of the Supertones.
Matt has
hey,
heard of the
this is
Supertones.
the segment of the show that we call "The People Have Questions." Tom,
Yeah, this is the main segment of the show.
this is the show.
This is actually
At
the
this
show.
point, although
Yeah.
this is the part of the
We
show.
should
we're
start
saying-
adding segments.
Yeah, this is. We also have announcements.
We have announcements. We have
Which
shout
is-
outs.
We have shout outs, which we did the Supertones,
Mhm.
confirmed by Matt. And then we also have things that we're musing about, like you'd like to expand the way that we get together and talk into microphones and front of
Correct.
cameras together.
I would like to do more. We're talking about other podcast topics and
bringing
things.
in wrestler
Bringing
Chad,
in Wrestler Chad, who
also known as Mixtape Chad.
also known as Mixtape Chad. Actually, he's never really been known as Wrestler Chad, but did he say
He said he'd never come on our show because he could never show his face, and then we came up with the compromise where he would get him the wrestling mask.
Why won't he come on the show?
He never wanted because fame. He doesn't want to be famous.
He doesn't want to be famous.
Comment below if you feel like Chad can still come on the show and not be famous.
We're not running the risk of running into
we're
Joe
not
Rogan
worried about
territory
it.
or something.
We're not worried about it. Yeah, but he's respecting our,
Yeah.
our audience's
Yeah.
proclivity to glory.
Yes. All right, let's get into the questions.
To the segment of the show called
Questions.
"The People Have Questions."
The
Tom.
people have questions.
Hey Matt, can we get a little when we start this segment of the show? Can we get a little like a little jingle called "The People Have Questions"?
Well, I think that might be. I mean, maybe I don't know.
Or we can ask Matt to write something like
We
that.
don't need Matt to write that.
Okay.
Anyway, okay.
50-50, comment below. Okay. First question. As always, these questions come from a time where Tom is teaching through ancient scripture, the Bible, and
Specifically now through the book of Revelation.
specifically in Boise, Idaho, at a church called Calvary Chapel
Yes.
on Wednesday night, specifically starting at around 6:30 p.m.
Yeah. Yep.
And then you teach through the Bible, and you
Correct.
tell everyone that you're sharing with, if you have questions, please send them in, and I will get together with my older brother Tucker Mail.
Younger. He's younger.
Well, it's a metaphor.
By the way, he's actually not as much younger as some people might think, though.
Yeah, I'm
like
he's, and in the metaphor, I am actually the older brother.
In the metaphor,
yeah.
Yeah,
I'm the older brother.
Yeah. You're 6 years younger.
5. Yeah.
You're gonna be 41, right?
Yeah.
I'm gonna be 47.
I'm gonna be 42.
You're gonna be 42.
Yeah.
I'm off by a year.
Yeah.
Okay, so yeah, so I thought that's the thing. I thought you were 5 years younger, but then I thought you were 40 still. So
yeah.
Okay.
So when you said not as young as people may think, you were talking to yourself.
That's actually true. Yeah. I just meant like people see my gray beard and my gray hair, and they see you're like you still got the.
But to counter it, I have the dad. I've got kids running around everywhere, and
that's true.
And you're a bachelor.
I'm still living life. My life hasn't changed since I was
like
18 years old.
Holden Caulfield. Look at your little outfit.
I'm like
trained in New York City. So yeah,
right.
I think we could potentially be the same age.
Yes, potentially.
But
yes.
Okay. But yes, so Tom teaches. He says if you have questions, I'll get together with my protege Tucker Mail, and we will do a show called Tuck and Tom. The people have questions.
The people have questions. All right, let's go.
Are you ready?
Yep.
Okay, so Tom, the people have questions today, and I'd like to ask you them,
okay.
and then if you wouldn't mind answering.
Okay, sounds good.
Okay. Is there any significance or correlation between 2 Chronicles chapter 9, verse 13, and Revelation chapter 13, verse 18?
The short answer is I don't really know, actually. Let me start off by just kind of giving some context to our viewers. Revelation chapter 13, verse 18 is the verse which lays out for us what the number of the beast is. It says the number of the beast is the number of a man. It is 666. And then in the Old Testament, in 2 Chronicles 9:13, when it's recounting Solomon's work in building the temple of God, it actually says that he was given to him, I should say, 666. I can't remember if it was talents or pounds of gold, but it was a measurement of gold, and there were 666 of them. And is there any connection between those two is what this question is asking. My gut reaction would be to say no. It's just kind of happenstance, but I'm not certain. What I can say is that I've never heard a teaching on either of these things that connected the two. I've never come across a pastor who gave any kind of insight into it that would seem to imply that there was some kind of connection, and I can't think of any real reason why there might be. One thing I would say is the only thing that could hypothetically be connected is that, of course, Solomon famously and very sadly towards the end of his life, he essentially walked away from the Lord. And so that's the one thing that, you could maybe say it's like a prophetic thing saying that he is going to slip away or something. But there's no reason to think that. There are a lot of people in the Old Testament who walked away from the Lord. So yeah, that's the short answer for that. Next question we got from Cody there.
Good. That was great.
From Cody there?
Yep, I'll get that one.
Okay.
Matthew chapter 13, verse 24. Parable. I have heard once an argument of annihilationists using this parable. What is a good argument for it? So summarize what this parable is talking about.
I talked about Matthew 13:24 yesterday when I was teaching, through Revelation, and it's the parable of the wheat and the tares. Mm-hmm. And if you guys recall, of course, in the parable, Jesus talks about how there's a good landowner who plants wheat in a field, and then his enemy comes in the middle of the night and plants tares, weeds basically. And when they start to sprout up, his workers come to him and they go, hey, somebody planted tares in here. Should we go through and rip out the tares? And he goes, no, because in doing so, you might actually uproot the good wheat. And he said, instead, wait until the end of the harvest or the harvest time. When that happens, we'll take it all out and we'll separate the wheat from the tares. The wheat will be stored in the barn and the tares will be thrown into the fire, right? Will be destroyed. So the second thing everybody would, I think, need to know in kind of reading this question is what annihilationism is. Annihilationism is a position that some Christians have, which states that hell is not an eternal thing. It's not a place of eternal conscious torment, which the traditional teaching of the church, like what Christians have always believed, is that hell is a state of the condemned or the damned where they experience torment forever. It's eternal. An annihilationist says they still go to hell. Annihilationists believe in hell, but they believe that hell is a place of final destruction. And I think, I mean, what would I take, or how could I respond to this particular question? My biggest thing is I just don't see annihilationism in that parable. My first thing is that, number one, a parable is always written with a point in mind, and you don't want to draw conclusions from every aspect of the parable. Right? Like, there is a single point, and the single point of this parable has to do with why it is that the wicked in this world who are going to be judged are allowed to just continue to exist along with the righteous that God has called. Why do we all exist side by side? Why didn't God just judge everybody right away? And this is an attempt to kind of explain, by comparing it to a farming metaphor, why things are going to continue through to a final judgment. That's kind of what it's saying. So we don't need to take anything else as like some kind of a point of doctrine. Having said that, what is the final destination of these tares? They're thrown in the fire, which is used throughout the New Testament as a metaphor of hell. And so, so far, it actually lines up pretty well, and it doesn't say one way or the other whether the tares stop or are stop being burned, or whether they're consumed. It doesn't say. It just says they're thrown in the fire. So nothing is really said about the end of the burning. So that doesn't strike me as a very strong argument for annihilationism. I think that there are some interesting arguments for annihilationism, and I'm willing to consider them. I have friends who are annihilationists, and they've kind of brought some of these arguments to me. And
you're going to share a couple?
I just, to be honest, I didn't have time to really look into the arguments, so not right now. I mean, I'm open to maybe bringing up some of these
here's a
later.
question then, is what is the theological consequence or reward of getting that part right? Is there a danger of going down the road of annihilationism as opposed to eternal torment?
So, I mean, I don't know. I don't, like, one thing I think, one danger that could exist going down the road of annihilationism is it might incline somebody to not feel the compulsion to preach the gospel, right? They might go, oh, well, if they're
like
going to
permanent sleep.
They're going to sleep. They're going to cease to exist.
Yeah.
Well, that's, I mean, yeah, they might hurt for a little bit, but they'll cease to exist, right?
Yeah.
And so that it might, in a sense, dissuade people from preaching the gospel. I really do believe that what a person believes about the afterlife has impact on their psychology and their
It's really interesting.
willingness to do something.
But even to that, even to the, well, maybe I won't preach as passionately, or isn't it, at least this is another philosophical question.
Yeah.
Isn't it better to preach the reward of heaven rather than, warn people of the consequence of hell? Not that you don't want to do both, but, I've always found the repent lest you be burned message to be less of, the good news gospel is that there is actually a place that God is creating a new people with. Not that you wouldn't want to warn against hell, because you have to.
Yeah, I totally get that. I think that it's more enticing for sure to preach the good side than the bad. I think it makes people maybe softer in their heart, whereas I think that harsh condemning preaching can maybe harden people's hearts and make them more angry. But at the same time, it is interesting, like just in kind of the practical ways of life, positive reinforcement does help, but negative reinforcement is also very, very strong. And I don't know if I could make a really good argument that negative reinforcement is stronger than positive reinforcement. Yeah. But my gut reaction is, at least in the regular things of life, it kind of is. Like that the children seem to react way more in a way more committed fashion in response to negative reinforcement than in positive reinforcement, right? You have a kid and you say, please do something and I'll give you a candy. He might do it, but if he experiences like real discipline, he's going to be, I think, way more inclined to do what's being demanded of him than he would be with a candy. Because I think you kind of sit there and say, well, I do like candy and I might be inclined to it, but it's not that big of a deal. This other thing is more important. But when the we just have such a strong pain aversion, Now, having said that, I've read lots of theologians on these subjects, and I am certainly interested in what people have to say in terms of how they interpret the passages concerning hell. But at the same time, it's difficult because at least whenever the New Testament speaks of areas that we do identify as hell, I'm going to pull up a passage here. There does seem to be a frequent connection to the eternality of it. And we just read it in Revelation in chapter 14. So
and
when we were
discussed it at length.
Yeah, we were just reading it in last week on the last week's podcast, did we not?
Yeah, we did.
So just a reminder, of course, that here in verse 11 of chapter 14, it says, the smoke of their torment ascends forever and ever, and they have no rest day or night, those who worship the beast in his image. Jesus, of course, in all of the synoptic gospels says that the worm does not die and the fire is not quenched. So you have a lot of things like that. There is a podcast I've downloaded that was done by an annihilationist that I keep intending to listen to from start to finish because it's a long podcast. So I'm actually really curious what arguments he uses, because there are times when I've seen annihilationists pick a verse or two that seem to speak of like an end, like of the destruction of something, but it's always very precarious. And the passages that seem, not precarious, that's the wrong word, they always seem kind of like real iffy though. But the passages which seem to speak to the eternality of judgment seem much stronger. And then throw in the fact that the position of the church throughout history, like, you know, from as far back as we can go, the position has been that hell is an eternal thing. So that's my, you know, what I would say here. Now, I would say, Cody, your last question here, what is a good argument for it? I don't know if you're arguing or if you're asking me for a good argument for annihilationism
or a counter-argument to
or
the parable.
Good counter-argument to the parable. So I just kind of gave my simple counter-argument to the parable. If you want a good argument for annihilationism, ask me again next week, and I'll try to do more research on it. I didn't have time to really look into the arguments that are presented. So that's cool. Where I'll leave that.
Well, and Cody, faithful to asked twice this week. So we go again to Cody. You brought up the bread of presence. My ADD mind thinks of Catholic transubstantiation. How do those two different? Are they similar?
Or how they're similar? Yeah. So just so everybody knows, the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation is the doctrine that, and if you've been to a Catholic church, especially if you were raised Catholic, you really know this. If you've been to a Catholic church, you certainly at least have seen how serious communion is. Like, the communion time is just different from the way it is for Protestants. When a priest takes the bread and prays over it, and when he takes the cup and lifts it up and he prays over it, in the Catholic belief, that bread and that wine are transformed literally, physically, like for reals, into the physical body and blood of Jesus, in such a way that a Catholic believes that if you were to take that bread at that moment, that bread is not bread. It is human flesh. And if you were to take the cup and you were to look inside, it would not be wine. It would be human blood. And when you eat it, you are eating human flesh, the flesh of Jesus. When you drink the blood, you're drinking, or when you drink the wine, you're drinking the blood of Jesus. I do not believe that. I don't think there's any scriptural warrant for it. I believe it's a doctrine that developed over a long period of time and was kind of by paces, kind of like bit by bit, kind of became what it is today. Although Catholics have believed it for a very long time. I will say, when the Protestant Reformation happened, a lot of Protestant reformers almost right away rejected it. Interestingly, Martin Luther, who you could look at as the guy who kicked off the Reformation, he continued to believe in a form of Lutherans don't call it transubstantiation, they call it consubstantiation. There's some mild differences, but more or less it's very similar. The idea is that the bread and the wine are Jesus's literal physical and body and blood. The Reformed Church, though, and the people who are connected with it, Ulrich Zwingli and John Calvin and those guys, they were like, no, the bread and the wine are symbols. They're metaphors. They're sacraments. They're things that we're supposed to take. And here we'll get to when we talk about the bread of the present. So again, for people who are tuning in, last night I referenced the tabernacle and the temple of Israel in the Old Testament. And in the tabernacle and in the temple, inside the holy place, you had a table. It was called the table of showbread. And on the table of showbread, there was a loaf's probably the wrong word, because it was unleavened bread that was placed there. And that bread was called the bread of the presence. So the idea that's implied there is that bread is like, in some mysterious way, the presence of God in some sense. And the priests, by the way, ate it. That was actually, they would sit in there on the table for the day, and afterwards the priest would take it, and it would be eaten as a part of the priestly meals. Or the next day, I should say, it would be eaten as part of the priestly meal. So when it's called the bread of the presence, I think it's doing the same thing that we do when we take communion, which is it's a symbol. It's something that's supposed to represent Jesus's body. It represents Jesus's blood. Well, in communion, the cup represents Jesus's blood. The bread represents his body. In the Old Testament, I think that was a symbol that pointed to the body of Jesus that would actually come into the world. But I don't think that that bread on the table was literally his body, nor do I think that the bread that we eat is literally his body, or that the cup that we drink is literally his blood. I believe that they are symbols that represent those things. And the main point of it is a memorial. It's supposed to be a thing of remembrance, so that when you eat the bread, you're stopping and you're focusing on that thing and you're remembering what Jesus did. Jesus, this comes up in John chapter 66. Sorry, not 66. John chapter 6. John chapter 6. Just pull it up here really quickly. So Jesus says this crazy thing to all of the people the multitude of people that the day before he had fed the 5,000, right? A lot of these people come and they're all surrounding him, and Jesus begins teaching, and he says, if you don't eat my flesh and drink my blood, then you have no life in you. And everybody's like, that's weird. And he goes, my flesh is food indeed, my blood is drink indeed, right? And it says that many of them, in verse 60, it says, many of his disciples, when they heard this, they said, this is a hard saying, who can understand it? And then Jesus said to him, does this offend you? So he asked him, is this offensive to you? And then in verse 66, it says, from that time, many of his disciples went back and walked with him no more. Okay. So many people took this very seriously and could not accept it. Right. Well, Jesus also, and I just realized I lost the verse, so I need to go back and find it. I skipped over it. Jesus said in verse 61, does this offend you? What then if you should see the Son of Man ascend where he was before? So if this is offensive to you, are you going to have a hard time believing that when I go up to heaven? What's that going to make you do? And then he says this, verse 63, and this is the key verse. It is the Spirit who gives life. The flesh profits nothing. The words that I speak to are spirit and they are life. So what he's saying right here is he goes, if you take what I'm saying and you think of it just as literal, the flesh, then you're missing the point, because the flesh doesn't give life. The flesh profits nothing. It is the Spirit that gives life. And then he says, my words are spirit and they are truth. So what he's saying is I'm teaching you a fundamental spiritual truth. And so John Calvin said that there is a spiritual or mystical sense in which Christ is present in the sacrament, not literally, not like that's his body, but like when you're taking it, there's a spiritual communion with Jesus, and you are being fed spiritually, not literally, right? And so that's the way I take communion, and I believe that all of the things in the temple and the tabernacle were exactly the same. None of those things were literally the thing they were pointing to. The high priest, when he goes into the Holy of Holies and puts blood on the Ark of the Covenant, he's representing the future high priest, Jesus, coming in and putting blood on the blood of atonement for us. But that high priest is not literally Jesus. The Ark of the Covenant represents God's throne, but it's not literally God's throne, right? So too, the table of showbread, which is where the bread of the presence is, that bread represents the body of Jesus that will come someday, but it's not literally the body. So that's how I
awesome.
That. Yeah.
Really helpful. Really helpful. Okay. Going to need some context here from last night as well, but it says the second goat is the scapegoat.
Yeah, I also mentioned, because I went through this whole discussion about the temple, the tabernacle, and the Day of Atonement when sins were atoned for by the high priest. By the high priest offering sacrifices. And I mentioned that there were two goats, and that he sacrificed one of those goats and took the blood and used it to atone for the Holy of Holy Place, or the most holy place, and he'd put it on the Ark of the Covenant. And then he would take the second goat and he'd put his hands on it and he'd pronounce and confess the sins of the people over the second goat, and then he'd send that second goat off, and it would be sent outside the camp. And as it was leaving the camp, the people would come in and mock it and spit on it and yell at it and like beat it and things like that. And here, and this is Craig, I know, because Craig came and told me that he put this on here, but Craig pointed out that the second goat is the scapegoat. That's actually what it was called, was the scapegoat, which interestingly, of course, this is where we get that word that we use today, scapegoat. When we call somebody a scapegoat, that means our sins are placed on him, right? It's like he takes the brunt of somebody else's failure. So that is where we got that word, and thanks for pointing that out, Craig.
Cool. Jeremiah chapter 11, verse 11. What about the righteous in Judah? There must have been more than 10. You mentioned Sodom in your last Tuck and Tom.
Yeah, so excellent question. So let me just read Jeremiah 11:11 for you guys to kind of give some context here. So this is the prophet Jeremiah making a prophecy against the children of Israel and telling them that because of their rebellion against God, their worship of Baal, and all of the crimes that they've been doing in light of that, like the sacrifice of their children and all of that kind of stuff, that it is not too far off that the Babylonians are going to come and judge them. They're going to destroy the city. They're going to destroy the country. They're going to take the people into captivity, which is interesting because that happened in 586 BC. It will happen again in 70 AD when the Romans do it. And here in verse 11, it says, "Therefore, thus says the Lord, behold, I will surely bring calamity on them," that is, on Israel, "which they will not be able to escape. And though they cry out to me, I will not listen to them. Then the cities of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem will go and cry out to the gods whom they offer incense, but they will not save them at all in the time of their trouble." So this is actually referencing something that happened long before what I was talking about yesterday, because I was yesterday talking about what was happening what was about to happen after Jesus' resurrection and ascension, which is the war between the Romans and the Jews. But almost 600 years previously, about 600 years previously, the same thing had happened with the Babylonians. And so it's a different prophecy about a different event, but it's the same kind of event. It's like, and for those of you guys who have been with me for a while, you know that I talk about how repetitions appear in Scripture, right? 586, the Babylonians come, they destroy Israel, they destroy the temple, they take the people and take them into captivity. 70 AD, the Romans do the exact same thing. They come, they destroy the country, they destroy the city, they tear down the temple, and they take the people and take them into captivity. So now then the question is, what about the righteous in Judah? Like, if this destruction has been brought, are there no righteous? It says there must have been more than 10. And so this is a reference to, because it was last week that we talked about Sodom and Gomorrah and how Abraham interceded on behalf of the righteous in Sodom and Gomorrah. And if you remember, God said, "I will not destroy that city if there are 10. I will not destroy that city if there are 10. And then it turns out, bless you, that there were not 10, but actually there were fewer, but God did get them out of the city. Now, so this is a good question. Why? What about them? Like, what about the righteous in the city? This is a tough question to answer, but I have two thoughts. First of all, number one, I don't think that we can take a look at that principle of that moment when God made that promise to Abraham that he would not destroy the city and apply that in all instances. Because there has been so much cataclysm over the years and many righteous people have died. And we know this. Like I forget exactly where this passage is, but in the Synoptic Gospels, Jesus is talking to his disciples and he mentions how a tower fell on some people. And he says, "Do you suppose that those people were worse than other people because that tower fell on them?" No, right? When the man who was born blind, he says, "Who sinned?" Or his disciples say, "Who sinned, this man or his parents, that he's born blind?" And he goes, "Neither, but that you might see the power of God." It seems very clear that Jesus is trying to pause and say, don't think that because somebody survives and is successful that they're righteous, and because somebody dies catastrophically that they're sinners. That's not necessarily true. Right. So what we can't say is that just because God brought judgment upon a place, that therefore all the righteous within should have survived. So I don't think anybody should take that as an absolute principle. I take that as a specific moment when Abraham and God were talking, and God used that to reveal something about his nature, which is that he does not delight in the death of the righteous, right? He doesn't delight in the death of the righteous. But that doesn't mean that there isn't an occasion for such where people will die.
Amen.
Now that's the first thing. Second thing I do want to say is this. The truth is that when it comes to the destruction of Jerusalem and Judea at the hands of the Romans, the history on this is pretty clear. these prophecies that we're talking about in the book of Mark, Matthew, Luke, right, the Olivet Discourse, and other prophecies that Jesus gave about the judgment that was coming upon Judea, Christians in Judea, so Jewish Christians, circulated this messaging. People knew about it, and the stories are really clear. People left the country before the Romans came. So what happened to those people? Those people who believed and trusted God and read the scriptures and read the prophetic statements, they were like, we can't stay here because the Romans are going to destroy us. They fled. So they actually were saved. I mean, you could look at them in a sense as like Lot. Him and his family was escorted out. These prophecies came to these Christian believers, these Jewish Christian believers, and they fled. They fled the city and they were saved. And I do want to add this one more thing too. Do not think that every Jewish person in Judea at that time died. There are accounts of other Jews who also escaped who were not Christians. I was reading up on this actually a little bit today, but there supposedly was a council of Jewish leaders that got out of Israel or out of Judea in time before the Romans came and destroyed, and they settled in a place called Yavna or Yamnia, where they actually sat down and kind of came up with like a whole new system of rules and principles for living a Jewish life that actually part of it was they were excommunicating Christians. Part of it was them actually condemning the Christians. Now, I was reading that some people actually disagree as to whether or not this happened.
Love these legends, though. Kind of like Masada, which we just saw. It's like these people who came and they, of course, their fate was...
Yeah, their fate was different. They were ones who were...
But they were thinking, like, we're going to take to the hills here.
Yeah.
You know.
Now, by the way, the group I just mentioned, though, who fled, that had this council, they were supposedly supported by the Romans. The Romans were like, fine. Yeah, you guys... They're like, we're not zealots. We're not trying to rebel.
Wow.
And the Romans like, go ahead. You can leave. And the Christians were, too. They're like, okay, you can leave.
Wow.
You know?
Interesting.
Yeah.
Really, really interesting. Basically looking for biblical precedents to understand how things play out as patterns.
Yeah.
Right?
Mm-hmm.
So thank you for your help. This one, you know, this is a good question. I think it's a very timely cultural question that I'm about to ask you. And it's not necessarily about the book of Revelation, but it certainly has to do with how to live in confusing times. Let's put it that way. So, and I this will be a conversation we can have, but how would you respond to a teen who is thinking about transitioning or is attracted to the same sex? So you've got a teenager, they're contemplating, you know, their gender identity, and they're wondering if they're born in the wrong body, or you've got a teenager, and maybe the response is the same for both, or maybe that's unique, but you've got a teenager that's opening up about attraction to the same sex. So what would you say?
Well, a couple of things. First, let me qualify by saying I'm not going to be able to talk at length about this. I could spend hours talking about this. So I do want to direct people to my teaching on Sodom and Gomorrah that I gave when I went through the book of Genesis. So if you could go back to YouTube and read through that, I actually did a section in that study where we read about Sodom and Gomorrah, read through kind of the basics of that story, and then I really addressed, over the course of an hour and a half, so a pretty lengthy discussion on certain aspects of the LGBTQ question. So I'm going to kind of leave some of that there, and I'll repeat a little bit here. So I just want to say a couple things in response, though. First of all, number one, there are two questions when it comes to this issue. There's the culture war question, and there is how do I talk to somebody who's struggling with this question? Those are two different questions, right? I can sit here on a podcast and I can tell you what is true and what is right, which is that the way that our culture speaks about sexuality, about LGBTQ issues, about homosexuality, and about the transgender movement and things like that is wrong. I believe that without question. And it's wrong at every level. Like, I mean, it's not just that I would sit here and say that engaging in homosexual sexual activity is immoral and wrong, which I believe it is. It's more than that. It's fundamentally when everything our culture says about it, I think, is wrong. When our culture says that ultimately you can take all of the demographic of people who live in a city or a country or whatever, all over the world really, and break them up into two distinct metaphysical or ontological categories. One of those being heterosexual and one of those being homosexual. And these categories do not change. They're bred deep inside of us, and a person who is homosexual just as much as another. Some people are born with two arms as opposed to one, and that homosexuality is a part of and parcel of their identity. That is not true. And so it's behavioral. It's behavioral, and it's not identity, as much as people want to make it about identity. So if I'm talking about the culture war and I'm talking about how do we discuss this philosophically and how do I argue for my points, that's one thing which needs to be done, and it needs to be addressed, I think, often and very clearly and articulated very clearly. But it is a different thing when you're talking to somebody that you love, especially if you're talking, for instance, to your child or something like that, and you're addressing things that they are confused about, things that they're wrestling through, and things that decisions that they're trying to make about certain things. And it's really tough because the numbers on all of this are very clear. That is that if you have children in this society, they are going to be talking with people about it. They're going to be thinking about it, and it's going to be such an overwhelmingly huge part of their lives in a way that it never has been in American history. Like when I was growing up, it was not a huge part of our lives. It was not accepted culturally at all, right? You might have, I mean, you had people who were gay for sure, and you had people who were trans for sure, but they kept it for the most part secret. And those who did kind of openly talk about it and discuss it, it was at best case kind of tolerated, and it was worst case, of course, proactively like persecuted. Like when I was in high school, I'm sure there were gay kids in my high school. Nobody said it. Nobody would come out and say that. That would not have been acceptable. They would have been ostracized for sure in the society. And what a lot of people don't know, and I brought this up in my teaching ways back, is the shift that we're in right now is a radical shift that happened very quickly. So just to kind of center people on how much our culture has changed, the first presidential candidates to ever run for president in favor of gay marriage came in the year 2016, and it was Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Donald Trump was actually the first person to formally, and this might surprise people, accept or acknowledge like that he was in favor of gay marriage. Barack Obama, in both of his presidential campaigns, both in 2008 and in 2012, ran publicly, officially, vocally against gay marriage. He said he did not believe that gay marriage was right and it should not be condoned in our country. So that's a liberal president on the left. What a lot of people don't know is in 2008, also the first year Obama was elected, California, the most left state in our union, or like the most, well, at least one of them, they had a referendum, that is a public vote, on whether or not to legalize gay marriage. It was defeated by 20%. That means 60% of Californians said no to gay marriage, right? It isn't until you get to 2015 during the Obergefell decision when all of a sudden the Supreme Court says that it's actually a constitutional right that cannot be inhibited for people to marry somebody of the same sex. And really, ever since 2015, it has been a massive, fast race into an entirely new world. And so there are a lot of issues at play in all of these things. And so it's like when I'm sitting here thinking about what to talk about in all of this, it's very difficult to kind of hone in on one or two issues. If I'm speaking to that, so I want to come back to this basic question. How do I talk to a teen who's struggling with this? I can't give direct, like do not listen to this and say, Tom just said the things I need to go tell my teen. Because I want you to pause and stop and think, how do I tell anybody that I love about the sin that they commit, right? How do I tell anybody? And the answer to that is that I tell them differently all the time in different ways. So it's like I just think about family members, for instance. If I have family, I mean, I come from a family that struggles with alcoholism, with drug addiction, with, I mean, you name it. There's so many different things that my family has struggled with over the years. And I've often looked at myself as like a moral force in my family, that meaning like I have a responsibility to call them out on their sins and to try to encourage them to change. Well, I've been in my family for 46 years. So how do I call them out on sin, and how do I talk to them about sin? Well, I've done it 1,000 different ways. Sometimes I'm like intense and I'm on them and I'm not letting them go, and I'm saying, you need to stop doing this, and we're going to talk about this until you're finally willing to at least talk, like to come. And sometimes I'm like, you know what? I need to back off. I've been too in their face. I've been too much. I need to start allowing myself, or allowing them, I should say, to feel the freedom to be around me without feeling like I'm just going to call them out for everything. Or I'll sit there and I'll say, I know my brother, for instance, feels this, has felt this many times, where he's felt like I can be so critical of him in his life that it's like he doesn't want to be around me, because even if he agrees with me, which actually, to be honest, most of the time he does, he's just like, he can't handle the burden of me constantly telling him what he needs to do differently. And I need to stop and go, okay, I need to back up. I need to be careful. I need to try to not always make it a point to call him out on every sin that he does. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So the truth is, guys, I mean, you just got to ask yourself, do you have family members and loved ones and friends who use drugs, or who are alcoholics, who can't control their drunkenness, who are gluttons, who cannot control their eating habits, or who commit affairs, who engage in adultery, who get divorced for unbiblical reasons? They get divorced because they actually just fell in love with somebody else, or because at the end of the day, they just don't want to be married to this person anymore. How do you react to all of them? How do you react to all of them? And what I can say is that in all these cases, it's different from, it's different in the circumstances. And one thing I can also say is most of us don't do well, because there's a temptation that we all have. And that temptation is to not say anything, because that's our culture. At the end of the day, the real problem in our culture is, and this is false, is that we believe that saying and doing nothing is the loving thing. We believe that saying and doing nothing about something is actually the loving thing to somebody. And that's not true. But at the same time, I say that because it's also tough, because it's not like saying whatever comes to your mind and telling them exactly the truth every time is always the loving thing. You know what I'm saying? Like it's tricky. And so let me just kind of give you a couple of things to consider. First of all, I do want to recommend a book. It's a book by a woman named Abigail Schreier. And it's called Irreversible Damage. Thank you so much. It's a book by Abigail Schreier. It's called Irreversible Damage. This specifically speaks to the trans issue. Abigail Schreier, as far as I know, is not a Christian. She was a journalist, where somewhere along the line, she started meeting parents who had kids who were teenagers, who were, and younger
thinking
probably,
about transition.
who were thinking about transitioning. And these parents were looking for advice. And what is the advice of the culture? The advice of the culture is, yes, let's celebrate it. If you're a good parent, you're going to celebrate it and tell them how awesome it is. That's the only way to be a good parent in this particular context. But of course, the reality is so much more complex than any of that. And Abigail Schreier, who did not come in just trying to defend biblical principles, she came in understanding that some things were going awry. One of the things is that it is not terribly uncommon for kids who in their teenage years start to identify as trans to, in their 20s and mid-20s and late 20s, to start actually kind of going back on that and trying and saying, I was a confused kid, and that is not true. Which, if all their transition meant was that they started using a different name and using a different pronoun and dressing differently, maybe not as big of a deal. But some kids go to pretty great extent, or pretty great lengths, right? And, if you'd told me back in 2008 or 2012 that there would be states in which children could go even without parental support and get prescription drugs, which basically hormone treatments that essentially repress, puberty blockers. They prevent puberty, or they, women getting testosterone so that they can become more masculine or male. Like, I would not have believed you. And you know this because you've seen me, right? I mean, we can give a shout out to Zach DuBois, right?
Zach,
I don't know if Zach's going to watch, but Zach will come to me
years ago. Zach would say, "Where's this going?" You're like, "Nowhere."
Yeah, Zach would always come to me with all these things like, "Look at this. What do you think of this?" I'm like, "Zach, you're exaggerating. This is not going to be as extreme as it is.
Yep.
And I would always say it's a slippery slope argument. Slippery slope arguments are not valid. And I don't remember how long ago it was. You were there, but Zach came to me and goes, "What do you think of that slippery slope right now?" You know, because it's a world I can't wrap my head around.
It's a slippery cliff.
It's a cliff, and so here's the thing, like, if kids are taking puberty blockers and taking hormones, and if they're getting actual surgeries, right, mastectomies and various things of that nature, well, that stuff actually can have irreversible damage on your body. And if you come to a later point and you come to the realization that that was wrong, then it could be very crushing and irreversible damage. And so, it's like for a little while there, I've never bought into anything about what the LGBT movement is saying ever. I've never been even remotely inclined.
But as a Gen Xer, it was certainly different back in the day.
Oh, for sure. But what I was going to say about that, having never bought into it, I did reach a point relatively recently in my life where I thought, you know what? If somebody comes to me and asks me to call them a certain pronoun or something along those lines, I can do it. I don't believe it. It's not right. But I don't need to argue with everybody. It's kind of like what I've been saying about how when somebody is in sin or when somebody's doing something, how do you address it? It's not easy to say. So, I wouldn't know exactly what the right thing to do is, right? All of the time. But I thought, you know what? I don't want to be in a fight with somebody. I don't want that to make them feel like I don't love them.
Your own wrestling.
If they really want me to call them by a certain pronoun, then I will. And I thought that. And I'm not telling. And I know other people who do that. I have parents who tell me that. I had a friend who just told me that the other day, who are Christians and love the Lord. But it wasn't that long ago. I was at my school and we were doing a little training where some people kind of came in and just gave us a lot of material on this particular subject and some testimonials, some videos. And there was a woman who was given extensive time. She told us her story. And this woman when she was about 17 or 18, she decided she was a man. And as a man, she started to insist that everybody call her a man and refer to her by her pronoun, by him, he, and call her new name. She started taking hormones, puberty. Well, I guess she'd already been through puberty, but she started taking testosterone and had a mastectomy and all that kind of stuff. And somewhere along the line, she realized it wasn't true. And now she's 25, 26. She had a man's voice. She has 5 o'clock shadow. She contracted diabetes because, of course, taking testosterone had this really adverse effect on her where she got diabetes, put on 50 pounds, had really, she said physically her body's just devastated. It's just totally destroyed. And she said, and at the end of the day, it was not real. She goes, it was none of that actually influenced what was, like, that wasn't what it was about. And there was something she said that really stuck with me. She said, when I did this, everyone in my life, everyone except for one person was approving. They all told me, this is great. Do it, do it, do it, do it. She said there was only one person. It was my grandfather. He pleaded with me, please do not do this. This is not right. And she goes, he's the only one who now I look back and I go, he loved me.
Yes.
Like he loved me in the midst of this. Everybody else was concerned about making sure that the culture told them exactly. And that's the thing, like none of us want to not love. Right? We all want to love people. We don't want to hate, and we don't want to be violent. And when people come out and say, if you don't say what we say, then you are committing violence. No, that's not necessarily the case. Maybe it could be sometimes.
But it's like you're co-opting someone's compassion and saying, okay, I'll just do it then because I don't want to be violent and I just want to help. And so it's a really hard sometimes. I think when you're in the moment, everyone but that grandpa, you can feel what they're feeling. Yeah, this woman is going through this season of her life seems very confusing. She needs support and help. And but I think it's, for me, as you were saying that about this woman specifically, and I mean this in really the most humility, the most humble way I can think of it, even for my own life, is this little story of the emperor's clothes. I can't help but think we're living right in the midst of a parade where that story where an emperor puts on an invisible cloak and everyone, to not disrespect the king, is yelling about how beautiful it is. And it took one person to say, he's not wearing anything. And you read it as a kid, and I remember thinking, why would that crowd ever go along with an emperor walking naked down the street just as to not offend him? And now we're living in a time where I do believe we'll look back on this time and it will be like a parade where so many people will think, I actually kind of deep down I knew that this person wasn't who they were saying they were.
Yep.
But as to not disrespect them, I
Mm-hmm.
just went along with it.
Yeah.
And who knows when the sea change will happen, but of course it will,
Yeah.
because truth prevails, and times of confusion, they kick up dust and it goes away, and we'll all look back, and this person who's thinking about how to, deal with people in this confusing time, you will look back, and I think the grandfather of that story, I think we'll all wish we were that person, as hard as it may be.
Well, that's why it changed my mind. Like I was like, I can't fold on this. I still am wrestling. So having said that, I don't have like a very clear path on what I would say in every instance, but I know that I cannot just like hold the line. Let me rephrase that. I should hold the line. I should hold my line.
Yeah.
I can't toe the party line on this, meaning the what our culture is telling us.
Yeah.
I can't let them. I can't let this idea of like trying to force people by manipulating their compassion, because that's what's happening.
Yeah.
It's people are compassionate and they care, and so they're being manipulated into doing certain things because they believe that's how you love. And this is not the only situation like that. We have a culture where nobody will call out anybody for anything.
Yes.
Right? Like this pertains to my own habitual sins over the course of my life, right? My weight and my history of overeating and different things like that. That's sinful. Gluttony is sin. It needs to be stopped. Okay? And yet we live in a culture where increasingly people are saying, you know what? It's not actually. And act like somebody just posted, somebody that I follow on Instagram, I don't remember who it was, on their story. Oh, it was one of my former students. She posted on Instagram that some, and I can't give you name and date and all this kind of stuff, but that some woman won Nutritionist of the Year for something. And she just commented because this woman clearly does not eat healthy. I mean, you can just tell by looking at her. But we live in this society which is saying you cannot call that out. You cannot recognize that. And here's the thing. It's like, this is just obvious. Like, this kind of stuff kills people.
Yeah.
It just does. It will kill you, unquestionably.
Well, it's under question now, in fact.
Well, no, but here's the problem.
Yeah.
If you actually know anything about it,
Yeah.
you know it's not under question, right? If you actually know what is involved and how the body works and what foods you eat and how much exercise you actually
And the effects
engage in,
of
and the effects of those things,
carrying
it's
extra
not
weight.
really questioning. The only thing is you have a group of people, and by a group of people I don't mean like 7. I mean you have this spirit of the time, so to speak, where people just want to, in spite of what we all know, assert things that aren't true. They just assert it,
Yeah.
and then they tag phrases to it, things like "science tells us" or what, and that's not true, right? It's like most people don't know how to what a scientific argument is,
No.
how people are using science. They just have no idea. So what they do is they just look for any article or something or a headline or a tweet, and if it's some way connected to some doctor or something, then they use it. And everybody does this. It's not just people on one side or the other on these subjects. Everybody does it, and nobody actually knows what an actual inductive argument that is supported by evidence looks like.
Yeah.
Almost nobody. And also people don't account for how much they themselves are swayed by what they want to be true, right? So anyway, having said all of that, I do want to bring up some of the things Abigail Schreier says, because I think they're super important. The woman who I mentioned who wrote that book, Irreversible Damage. She did a long, deep dive into the history of the of basically transsexualism and transgenderism in America and in Western Europe, kind of basically looking through psychological records throughout history. And we actually have a lot of information, a lot of data on this subject, because of course you've always had people who wrestled with their identity in terms of their gender and who have felt like they were a different gender, something like that. We used to call that body dysphoria, right? You had gender dysphoria. You had this sense that the gender you were was not what you felt, like your physical body, your male or your biological sex didn't match with your gender. And that's something that's been there. Like you can read stories in antiquity of people who really seemed to suffer from this. And it is throughout basically all of history been considered a psychological illness, right? By the way, it technically still is. It is actually in the DSM, which is the guide that is that psychologists are supposed to use it's a diagnostics manual for diagnosing psychological illnesses, mental illnesses. And gender dysphoria remains in there. Even now, it's still considered one. And that's because it clearly is, right? Lots of people have real experiences where they cannot take reality, like an objective, clear reality, and mesh it with what they feel, right? I remember so many times, I remember riding on a bus down to Utah, and there was a guy who got on the bus, and he told me that Moses had appeared to him and told him to go to Salt Lake, and that on his way to Boise that he had been kidnapped by aliens and taken to the bathroom, and the blood was drawn out of his finger and put back in. That is not connected with actual reality. No. This is a non-reality. And so the question is how do you talk to somebody who is wrestling with that? Because it's not always clear, right? Mm-hmm. I had a woman who came here, and she, after a Wednesday night, she came and sat next to me, and she said, "I really need to talk to you." And I said, "Why? What's going on?" And she says, "There are CIA agents in every one of the prayer rooms right now, and they're waiting to arrest me." It's hard to know they weren't, this was, again, reality is not connected. How do you talk to somebody in that kind of a circumstance and a situation? It's not easy. It isn't necessarily the case that you just say to them, "You're wrong, let me tell you the truth," because they don't take it, right? Yeah. So gender dysphoria is something that we've had for a long time. And you know what? Very few people are afflicted with it. Very, very few. The data on this is super clear. It's way less than 0.5%. And there's some other things Schreier points out that is super interesting. For the last 100 years, we have this body of information. It tells us way less than 0.5% of people are afflicted with it. Number two, those who are afflicted with it, typically if it's diagnosed early amongst children, it actually ends up disappearing when they hit puberty. The vast majority of them, once they go through puberty, the dysphoria actually disappears. And by the way, they're rigorous in how they identify this. It's not just any kid saying, when I was a kid, I told my mom, "I'm Wonder Woman," and I ran out because I was, whatever. I was...
Sure.
They're not diagnosing everybody who says that as gender dysphoric. It's when you have a persistent insistence that seems to cause pain to a child that he or she is the opposite gender. And so what they find is the vast majority, so it's way less than 0.5%, and the vast majority of it all disappears by puberty. And there's one more factor that's super interesting, and that is that almost 98% of all cases are in biological males. Men experience it, not women. It's so insanely rare for women that it's incomprehensible. And I can tell you this, I have never in all of my historical readings read about a woman who was, I read about lesbians, but never read about a woman who really presented herself historically as a man. Now, I'm sure there were some. I'm not saying that didn't exist, but definitely we just don't have a record of it. We do have it for men. It's for sure there for men. Now then, she took those numbers and she contrasted them with what has happened since 2016. Okay? So since 2016, those numbers are very weirdly off kilter. The number of people who identify as trans in the youngest generation right now, Gen Zers, is 13%.
Unbelievable.
Now, that's not true. Yeah. There are not 13% of people who are actually suffering from gender dysphoria. Yeah. There aren't.
It's a mania.
Number two, the vast majority of them are women. Over 90% are girls. That is not consistent with anything we've learned about gender dysphoria. Throughout history. So let me say a couple things then about this. At this point now, you have to come up with theories as to why is this happening. And there are a lot of theories out there, and it's really hard to prove theories, or at least the truth is you can't prove any scientific theory, not if by proof you mean unquestionably this is the answer. You can't do it. So the question is what evidence is there out there? Now some people will say, well, the problem is it's just now more acceptable, and so more people are just coming out and telling the truth. No, yes, it is more acceptable for sure, but at the same time, these numbers are staying consistent along generational lines. In other words, in 2016, or not in 2016, but around that time, when all of this started, when the lid kind of came off the jar, and all of a sudden everybody started. You just had this massive uptick. This jump to 13% happened in Gen Z. It did not happen amongst millennials, amongst Gen X, amongst baby boomers, and all of them live in the same culture that Gen Zers
do.
If it was the case that these guys were all just secretly holding it in, they would feel empowered to take it off and to unhold it, right? But the numbers are staying consistent. right? And by the way, the number is increasing each generation, which that actually coincides with the idea that each generation takes it a little bit better than the previous. So like baby boomers, it's about 1% of baby boomers identify as homosexual. So we're not even talking about trans stuff. It's actually just over 1% identify as homosexual. You get to Gen Xers, it's about 3%. So it goes up. Gen X, our generation. You get to millennials, and it's up to 5%. So there's an increase. You get up to Gen Z, and you're talking, like, I've seen numbers as high as 20%.
Wow.
But that all gets confusing because of all of the language. Because it's not because there's, like, when we were in high school, it was you were gay or you were straight, and that was it.
And now it's queer.
There's gender queer. There's
non-binary.
Like there's pansexual. Like all sorts of different things. We had bisexual back then. I forgot to mention that, right? So having said all of that, of course, what's the explanation for it? Schreier posits this argument. I think for most things that happen socially, there are lots of explanations. So I don't want to be reductivist and identify one thing, but I find what she says very compelling.
It's TikTok. It's probably
in a sense, she says yes. That's what it is. Here's what she says. She says what's going on is we have a massive uptick in all sorts of mental health issues, which is true, right? The mental health of our children, of Gen Z, of the younger millennials, is way worse off than previous
their minds
generations.
are being polluted.
And their minds, it's like, and the mental health, what causes all these mental health issues, it's a million different things. She does see a strong correlation. I think this is true with social media type stuff.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and one of the things that she connects specifically with it is this. She goes, she just gave one story that really stuck in my mind. Instagram. What is Instagram? Instagram is a place where your whole identity is connected with like how many likes you get, like, and she said for a lot of women what this means is I want to put pictures of myself, beautiful pictures of myself, and I want people to like them, and if I put up a picture that I think is beautiful and I get lots of likes, then I'm affirmed, right? But what happens if I put up a picture and I don't get the likes?
Nobody likes it. All of a sudden, maybe I have the wrong body.
And she basically says it's causing serious mental issues. A lot of people start to feel like that something's wrong with them. And here's the thing. Now then, when you have all these mental health issues before you to choose from, like not just choose from, but you're trying to identify what's wrong with me. Like kids are trying to figure out what is wrong with me right now. There's this one thing which used to be identified as a pretty detrimental mental health issue.
Oh yeah.
But if this is it, then everybody's going to love you, because that's what happens, right? Because when somebody then comes out and says, well, they're gender binary or they're queer or something like that, you get lots of affirmation.
Yeah.
Every like is an affirmation.
Yep.
Everybody telling you that this is great, that you're like, this is awesome.
So proud of you. We love you.
Yeah. Now this is one possible explanation. I'm not trying to say that's every possible explanation. So here's the thing. I say all of this because some people are genuinely gender dysphoric. That is, they have a deep, serious, internal mental health issue that is going to be very hard to straighten out, that I don't really know exactly what the answer is to that. And sometimes when you encounter a kid, that's going to be the problem. But way more often, I think you're going to be encountering a child who has lots of other issues that they're wrestling through. And some of it may not even be issues in the sense of mental health issues. A lot of it might actually just be, in one sense, normal. So hear me out on this. What I mean by this is, when we get to be teenagers, we're always trying to figure ourselves out. I did, you did. We're all trying to figure out our life. And when they're in school and everybody's telling them all these different things, some of them are just genuinely going, well, maybe. Like they're literally just kind of going, well, maybe that's it, right? Maybe that's it. And then they'll apply a label. You and I have talked about. We have friends who identify as genderqueer, who call themselves or trans or something like that, and they'll call themselves that, but and they'll say that they're pansexual or something, but then or bisexual, but then they will always date somebody of the opposite sex. They might wear their hair longer. They might, like if it's a guy, he might wear his hair longer. He might maybe put some makeup on or something, but he's dating a biological woman, right? And so when that happens, I don't know how much of that is actually mental health issue as much as just this is the culture we now have to kind of navigate through.
It really does seem to be the way you just find your people now.
Yeah, it really does. And so now, this is my final thing on this. How do you talk through all these issues? There's no one way. The biggest thing is talk to your kids. Be honest with your kids. Don't try to hide anything. Tell them the truth. But also, when you tell them the truth, don't make them feel like they're attacked. Like, don't make them feel like, don't put them in a position where they feel like they can't be honest with you, because then what's going to happen is, like, if you just drive them away in that sense, then they're going to, they're going to go hear from everybody else and not from you. But having said that, don't let them define that, because you have to still be honest. Like, you still have to tell the truth. You can't just let it slide.
Yeah.
Because if you just let it slide, then, and now mind you, that doesn't mean, understand me on this, that doesn't mean that every time you see your kid, you need to say, by the way, don't forget, everything you told me I think is wrong. All of your worldview is wrong. What I would say is talk with them, hear them, listen to what they say. Where you can see a clear path of pushing back and resistance, tell them that.
Yeah.
Make it very clear to them what you believe, what you think. Make it clear to them what the scriptures say, what, why it is that as Christians we don't believe this stuff. Make those things clear. But you don't need to tell them every time you see them.
No.
You can love them, you can have them in your presence, you can be with them and with their friends. You can love them.
And that's such an important caveat.
Mm-hmm.
If you're only talking about this and you're calling emergency meetings, and every time you and your child or this person that you care about, this is the only topic on the table, it's like there's no actual relationship other than this one thing. Yeah. And I think, one book I'd also recommend, I think the Irreversible Damage book is a must read. And I think there's another book called Keep Your Kids Close. And I read it, and it's not necessarily about just this topic, but it's really describing what you just said. You have to have a relationship with people that is broader than one specific topic or one specific season of their life. We, as a culture, have the problem with social media and TikTok and all of these apps is because it's oftentimes replacing the person they're orienting around is no longer the wise counsel of a parental figure. It's now peers that are going through the same chaos and confusion as everybody else. And it's an excellent read. It talks about how children need something to have as orientation. Teenagers, young people, most people, you need to orientate around something. And for thousands of years, you had all of your orientation around the people that elders. Yeah,
family.
And now we have peer orientation, and it's failing miserably.
And peer orientation and media orientation. Yes. Right? Movies, television, music, social media, right?
And so you have to bring it back to the design of, I'm in your life, and we are going to talk about these matters. We're going to talk about other matters. We're going to do things together. I am not going to allow your influence to be co-opted by the culture. Yeah. So, interesting stuff.
Yeah, good question. Stuff. Great question. There's a lot more that could be said on this, and
great question, a timely question,
timely question,
and a great answer. Great answer.
Likewise.
The last thing, and this is just a staff appreciation day and week, really. The last question is thank you.
Yeah, and thank you.
Thank you for Tuck and Tom.
Thank you for Tuck and Tom.
And I think the real thanks for that one is Matt. We just want to say, we love you, brother.
Matt, we love you.
We think you're amazing.
And actually, it's true, and it is Staff Appreciation Day.
It is Staff Appreciation Day, I guess. And this culture also has a day for everything.
Yes.
When I found out it was Staff Appreciation Day, I started.
Oh, it's like actually a thing.
It really is.
I didn't know that.
It's Administrative Staff Appreciation Day.
Really?
Yes.
Didn't know that.
And so I just started wondering what other days there were. Found out that Noah has a day in November, Noah Appreciation Day. There's a Jessica Appreciation Day.
Wait, just by their days?
Just the name.
Just the name?
Yeah, there's just the name. There is, we did staff appreciation so that our custodial crew could be involved. And I said, why don't we just do that one? And that's in October, Custodial Appreciation Day. But Podcast Audience Appreciation Day is every day.
Every day.
Love you guys, and I love you. I love Matt.
Love you.
I love this
love
guy.
Matt. Love you
Tuck
guys.
and Tom. Peace.